Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be taking you through 5 great works of classic fiction. As with my list on Gothic novels, this list isn't ranked. It's just 5 wonderful works of fiction that I think are well worth your time. First on my list we have the second oldest piece of Western literature, and that is the Odyssey by Homer. The Odyssey is an epic poem and sequel to the Iliad, which dealt with the story of the Trojan War. The Odyssey tells the story of Odysseus, a warrior who took part in the Trojan War, as he tries to return to his homeland, Ithaca. In his absence, it is assumed that he has died, and his wife Penelope and son Telemachus must deal with a group of unruly suitors who compete for Penelope's hand in marriage. The Odyssey was the first piece of ancient Greek literature that I read outside of philosophy. I wasn't expecting to necessarily like the Odyssey, not because of the story or anything that I knew about it, but because I expected it to be kind of like some of the philosophy, which means dense and heavy and maybe just a bit difficult to read. Luckily, I was wrong about this. In fact, this is probably one of the most readable pieces of ancient or even older literature that I've ever read. The Odyssey is a poem, and what this means is there are several narrative devices that make it very easy to read. First of all, you have a lot of repetition of similar themes and words, so images get repeated in your mind and embedded in your mind. The language is also somewhat economical, but also still playful and interesting when it has to be. And these two things, using simple repetitive language, just gives you a very, very strong set of images in your head that reoccur as you read the poem. In terms of translations, I'd recommend the recent-ish translation by Emily Wilson. Not only is it beautifully written, but it also comes with a very informative introduction that sets some of the context, so if you don't know that much about the mythology and backstory to the Odyssey, it's useful for that. It also contains a little bit of analysis about the text, which is really interesting and just sets the scene for the whole poem. There's lots to like about this novel. You've got all kinds of fantastical creatures. Obviously you have the gods and the goddesses, but you've also got cyclopses and sea monsters, not to mention a huge cast of human characters to root for and to despise. In one of my favourite scenes, Odysseus travels down to the underworld, Hades, where he discovers the spirits of those who died in the Iliad. This is a great scene, and it really connects the character of Odysseus with the stuff that happened to him in the previous book. Overall, the Odyssey is just a great classic fantasy adventure tale. It's fast-paced, well-written, and it's got one of the most interesting mythologies behind it if you want to dig deeper into that stuff. Okay, making quite a time leap ahead for the next novel on the list, which is David Copperfield, written by Charles Dickens, and published in a serial format between the years 1849 to 1850. This novel tells the saga of David Copperfield, starting with his impoverished and unhappy childhood and taking us to the discovery of his vocation as a successful novelist. Among its gloriously vivid cast of characters, he encounters his tyrannical stepfather Mr. Murdstone, his formidable aunt Betsy Trotwood, the eternally humble yet treacherous Uriah Heep, the frivolous and enchanting Dora, and the magnificently impecunious Mr. Micawber, a character resembling Dickens' own father. The description of this novel pretty much captures everything that I love about this novel. I know that sometimes Dickens gets called out for having these cardboard characters, but actually I find that his characters are just incredibly distinctive and they just stand out because they have unique character traits that set them apart from everyone else. Although I appreciate this complex, nuanced character, sometimes I find that characters who can be too complex end up just being kind of the same person over and over again, especially when that is not done very well, which a lot of the time it can be. I also think Dickens captures some of the ways in which we actually view other people. Oftentimes in our memories when we think about people, we remember them only for one or two qualities. So everyone in our heads can sometimes appear as a caricature. And I think in a story like this, where you're telling the story of someone's whole life from their perspective, having this kind of caricaturized view of these people actually really works. Also, the cast of characters, as I say, the description kind of suggests this, are just so colourful, interesting and bright. It's just a really joy to read. In fact, there wasn't a single character, even the horrible characters in this book, that I actually found boring or uninteresting. Now this is one of the bigger novels on this list, but don't let that intimidate you. Because the novel was originally told in a serialized form, most of the chapters actually are sort of self-contained episodes of David Copperfield's life. It's the kind of novel where you can maybe read a chapter or two and then just leave it for a few weeks and then come back to it as if you're kind of checking in on a friend. Overall, David Copperfield is a beautifully written novel with a very likeable protagonist, surrounded by a great cast of characters, and is just a real joy to read. My third choice for this list is Crime and Punishment, written by Dostoevsky and published in 1866. Crime and Punishment focuses on the mental anguish and moral dilemmas of Rodion Raskolnikov, an impoverished ex-student in St. Petersburg who formulates a plan to kill an unscrupulous pawnbroker for her money. If you want to know how to write a perfectly tense scene, then look no further than Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. The setup in the scene where Raskolnikov is meditating on the murder that he's about to commit, and then the slow build-up to that murder, all in the first part, so this isn't really a spoiler, it's the instigating incident of the novel, is so well done. So in the initial setup, Raskolnikov is going through various different reasons for why he may or may not kill this woman. He even has a pretty terrifying fever dream at one point, and as a reader you're just thrown into this kind of crazy psychology of this person about to do a terrible thing. Then you have the actual setup for the crime, and the crime occurring, and the aftermath of the crime, and all of this is just so tense. You just want to keep turning the pages to find out what's going to happen next. One of the most difficult parts of this novel when you're analysing it, or thinking about it, is trying to work out why Raskolnikov actually did the crime. There are lots of reasons that we get in the novel. He's impoverished, he's potentially mentally ill, he has this very crazy sort of nihilistic ethical theory that he wants to justify. All of these things seem to go together as possible motives, but we never really know what his true motive was when he did it. In addition to Raskolnikov's plot, he's also surrounded by a set of really interesting characters, some who even have their own side plots that are also just as well worth following and investing in. In particular, I really like the character of Razumikin, who is Raskolnikov's sort of happy-go-lucky friend, who acts as a very great foil to Raskolnikov, who is basically this angsty, nihilistic teenager. I also really like the character of Petrovich, who is the superintendent detective that follows Raskolnikov and investigates the murder. He's definitely up there with the likes of Poirot and Sherlock Holmes in terms of his wit and entertainment value. I also really like the secondary plot where we follow Raskolnikov's sister Dunya as she's stalked by this crazy libertine character whose name I really struggle to pronounce in a book where most of the characters' names are difficult to pronounce, Svidrigailov. This results in a great tense confrontation between these two characters that almost rivals the original opening part of the book in terms of its ability to build tension, and keep those pages turning. Overall, Crime and Punishment is just an interesting book that explores really deeply the psychology of someone who commits a crime, as well as some great subplots intertwining with the main plot, with everything coming together in really clever and unexpected ways. Fourth on this list we have Howard's End, written by Iain Foster in 1910. Howard's End tells the intertwining stories of three families in England at the beginning of the 20th century. There are the Wilcoxes, rich capitalists with a fortune made in the colonies, the cultural half-German Schlegel siblings, Helen, Margaret and Tibby, and the Basts, an impoverished and young couple from a lower-class background. The idealistic, intelligent Schlegel sisters seek to help the struggling Basts and to rid the Wilcoxes of some of their deep-seated social and economic prejudices. For me, I don't think any author, except for maybe Dickens, comes as close to perfecting the English novel, if you like, than Iain Foster. He is incredibly sharp and precise in the way that he understands the things like the English class system, English mannerisms and social conventions, and he generally manages to create some of the most thoughtful and interesting characters that definitely don't come across as one-note or cardboardy in the way that maybe sometimes Dickens characters do. What I also like about Foster is that although he tackles social issues, he always manages to do this without coming across as incredibly preachy and without having characters, kind of morally good characters, that come across as, the Mary Sue or the Mary Lou character. Even the Schlegel sisters, Margaret and Helen, are not entirely perfect and flawless. They're definitely the characters that we're meant to root for, but Foster's not interested in presenting them as completely flawless individuals. Oftentimes, their idealism forces them to look down on people. They've got that kind of paternalistic, patronising sort of moralising about them, especially when they're helping, although in some sense looking down on, the characters of the Basts. At the same time, the villains of the piece, especially Mr. Wilcox, is still someone who's presented in a somewhat sympathetic light. He's not just the evil, angry capitalist that hates everyone, even though he definitely does have some of those characteristics. Another thing I really like about Foster is usually his novels always end up with one of his characters giving some kind of impassioned speech to the kind of character that's representing, the law and the order and the country. In this novel, Margaret gets that role, and she delivers such a great speech to Mr. Wilcox, where she calls him out for his lack of care for the working class and his recklessness towards them that gets them, the working class characters, the Basts, into a lot of trouble in the novel. It actually really annoyed me when I watched the film version of this, because they cut that speech and I think that with this novel, that speech is the core of the novel. All the same, that's a really good film. It's got Emma Thompson and Helena Bonham Carter starring in it, and it's definitely worth checking out if you've read the book. Now, in most of Foster's other work, he touches on very similar themes, but I think Howard's End is the novel where everything comes together perfectly, and it's definitely the novel that has the most heart. For the final novel on this list, we have To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, written in 1925. 1927. To the Lighthouse is a postmodern novel which centres on the Ramsay family and their visits to the Isle of Skye in Scotland between 1910 and 1920. Now, from that synopsis, you might not think this is a very interesting novel, but that's because To the Lighthouse is not really about plot at all. That's not to say that nothing happens in the novel, it's just that that's not really the thing that we're meant to focus on. We're meant to focus on the internal dialogues and thoughts of the various characters that feature in the book. Woolf uses a technique called internal focalization. This basically means that she focuses on the internal mindsets of the characters rather than focusing on external things such as action or dialogue. In fact, in the novel, there is barely any dialogue or action described outside of what's going on in people's own minds. To make things even more confusing, Woolf even jumps from perspective to perspective, sometimes in the same paragraph or even the same sentence. This makes it a book that's very hard to get into, but definitely worth it when you do. In fact, I originally tried to read To the Lighthouse about 2 years ago, and I gave up after about 3 or 4 attempts because I would get so far, lose track of which character I was meant to be, reading about, and in the end I just thought, nope, this is too much, so I gave up. Recently I decided to give it another go. I bought the audiobook version, which is read by Juliet Stevenson, and I just sat there and listened to the majority of it in one sitting because it's quite short, and I actually found that it all went together and I really enjoyed it. So yeah, if you're struggling with reading it, maybe give the audiobook a try. None of the characters in this book, at least the characters that we get internal access to, come across as shallow or one-dimensional at all. Woolf just captures those internal dialogues perfectly. A really good example of this is in a dinner scene in the novel. At one point, Mrs. Ramsay is sitting at the table, and one moment she's thinking about one guest, then she looks at the fruit bowl and she starts thinking about the fruit and how she doesn't want anyone to remove the fruit because it looks nice, and then she goes from that to thinking about her own mortality and her children's futures. I think that is just so perfect in terms of how our actual thoughts work. One moment you're thinking about something completely inane, and the next minute you're thinking about, some deep philosophical problem or some of your deepest fears or worries for the future. One of the best things about this novel is that its style, its writing style, is, to this day, it still reads like a modern novel. That's not something you can say oftentimes about a classic, where the language always feels stuffy, and that can sometimes create a barrier between you and your ability to connect with the work. Overall then, this is a piece of postmodern literature that, despite being postmodern, has a lot of heart to it. Okay, that's everything for today's list. Please let me know in the comments below what are your favourite works of classic fiction. And who knows, I may even put them on one of these lists in the future. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content, and I will see you all in the next video. Goodbye.